Hey, I'm Anthony Effinger, and I'm delighted to be here with Roger McNamee today. Welcome, Roger.
Anthony, great to be here.
Virtually back to Oregon. I know you spent a lot of time here.
I have, and I want to say to all the folks in Canada, bienvenue, which I believe would be a better pronunciation than what Ajay gave us.
So I wonder if we could start by with a maybe a heavy lift. If you could tell people about your book, Zucked, Waking Up to the Facebook Catastrophe. For people who haven't read it, I got to tell you, I've been pressing this book into people's hands for a couple weeks now, and it's a must-read. It scared the shit out of me, so thanks for that. But could you just tell people who haven't read it yet what your central thesis is about why Facebook is a threat to democracy?
So Anthony, thank you for reading it and two, sharing it. So I spent 34 years in Silicon Valley as an investor in America's tech industry, and I was incredibly lucky. I arrived there in the days before personal computers were really an industry. And so I was lucky enough to grow up inside the Valley of the same age as Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. And so I like Forrest Gump or Zelig, I just constantly found myself in the right place at the right time. In 2006, I got asked to meet with a young entrepreneur named Mark Zuckerberg, who was, at that time, he just turned 22. Facebook had just, I guess it was 2 years old, had 9 million users, all high school and college students. There wasn't even a news feed yet. And he was facing an existential crisis. And the question was, could I help him resolve it? And as it happened, I was able to help him resolve it. And so what this book is tells the story of my journey from being an advisor to Mark Zuckerberg and one of the people who helped him both keep the company independent in the early days and to begin to make it into a business. I stopped being involved in 2009, but I obviously was a big fan, so I paid attention. I was a cheerleader. But in 2016, all of a sudden, I started to see things going on that scared the crap out of me. Basically, I saw civil rights violations and election interference, starting in the Democratic primary in New Hampshire in early 2016. Then there were issues with Black Lives Matter that were civil rights related. Then Brexit in June of 2016 was when I realized, oh my God, the same tools that make advertisers so successful could be used to interfere in an election. And I went looking for allies, couldn't find any. Finally got a chance to write an op-ed, which I shared with Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg 9 days before the 2016 election. And needless to say, they did not take it seriously. But I went to them as a friend, and I spent 3 months trying to persuade Facebook to do the right thing, which is to accept that its product had gotten so big that unintentionally it could be used to undermine democracy and public health and all these other issues. And so the journey has been wild because I knew a lot about Facebook going in, but I always had a very idealized view of what the product was because Mark's initial vision was in fact a very good one. But in the years between 2011 and 2015, the company evolved a business model that's really dangerous. And they really borrowed it from Google. And it's something that the Harvard professor Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism. And the notion that Google figured out that Facebook then imitated was that you could convert human experience into data. And that by capturing all that data, creating a data voodoo doll of every digital interaction of every human being, you could both predict people's behavior. And then if you controlled a platform like Facebook or Google, you could actually use your control of the app and all that data to manipulate people, to alter their choices and drive them in directions that are useful to you. And that had become a thing. And by 2016, you could use it in such a way that you could discourage enough people from voting to change the outcome of an election, where you could literally create a false reality in the United Kingdom in support of Brexit. You could do a similar thing in Brazil. And that stuff just terrified me. And I was faced with this choice of either just sitting back and doing nothing and going, hey, I'm retired, not my problem. or I could do what I did, which is I decided to become an activist and share what I knew. And the book was a big part of that.
And you, in the beginning, you were like a lone voice in the wilderness. I mean, you had trouble getting audiences with people. Is that right?
Oh, definitely. I mean, you have to remember that in 2016, the tech industry could do no wrong, even in politics, right? I mean, it from 1956, which is when the computer industry began, until about 2004, 2006, every tech product ever created basically enhanced the life of the people who used it. Beginning between 2006 and 2010, the nature of technology changed, and with it, the culture of Silicon Valley. It suddenly became possible for the first time to create global software products that could be used by everybody simultaneously, right? That wasn't possible until, the second half of the first decade of the century. And once you could do that, you could impose your view on people, which allowed predatory business models. So suddenly, people were using data to harm the people they took the data from. And that, to me, was terrifying. And at the beginning, people just looked at me like, oh, come on, Roger, it can't really be that bad. But we got really lucky. In the summer of 2017, I went with Tristan Harris and Renee DiResta, two great researchers. And we went to Washington. And we got to visit with Senator Elizabeth Warren and Senator Mark Warner. And the incredible thing was they asked us, what did we think had happened in the 2016 election? And I gave them a list of hypotheses, 7 or 8 hypotheses about what might have happened, how the voter suppression would have worked, how the data sets would have worked. All these things that we couldn't prove because we had no evidence. But it was Occam's razor. It was the simplest explanation for what you had seen. And then we got incredibly lucky, Anthony. I mean, within a month of being in Washington, most of those things were validated in the press. So suddenly they think we're Nostradamus, right? And we get invited back in the fall of 2017 to meet with dozens of members of Congress. And from that point forward, that became my focus, trying to educate members of Congress. And if you saw any of the early hearings, you know that they didn't start with much of background, because in Congress, they knew one thing was true, that tech could do no wrong. So nobody worried about regulating. But like the chemical industry in the 50s, where they would pour waste products like mercury into fresh water without consequences, right? At that point, the chemical industry, which was a huge part of the economy, had become a threat to life and limb, right? Because it was so bad for the environment, so bad for public health. And that's where tech is today. They're doing the equivalent of pouring mercury into fresh water. And, the point is not to get rid of them. The point is to fix the business model so that it can coexist with public health and democracy and privacy and all the other things that we value in a democracy.
Well, you talk about in the book about how, the Obama administration and administrations before that had all been just fine with tech, had courted tech.
For good reason.
Yeah. And they didn't realize, what was in their midst.
Well, hang on. It wasn't just them. I mean, I was at one time an insider and I missed it, which is terribly embarrassing. But
well, what I took away is, everybody talks about dangerous AI coming in the future. But what I take from your book and from work by Tristan and others is dangerous AI is already unleashed in the world. And it's
totally.
Facebook and Google and YouTube and the algorithms that just push this content at us.
But it's not just there. So here's the fundamental problem. Silicon Valley has, because of, the United States has been deregulating business for 40 years. And so the way capitalism works, it's like a garden, right? Capitalism's not a natural state. If you want to have an economy with lots of diversity and lots of competition, lots of small businesses, somebody, usually the government, acts as the gardener to clean out all the weeds and keep the rules working for everybody. We spent 40 years eliminating that consciously. We basically decided to let the market rule everything. Well,
starting with Milton Friedman.
Exactly. Exactly. Right. That's what it was. And the point is, after 40 years, economic power in the United States is incredibly concentrated in every industry. So everything is monopolized. And if you think about it, monopoly isn't actually the same as capitalism, because in monopoly, it's inherently authoritative. Oh, sorry, authoritarian. Where capitalism has elements of a democratic model built into it because it's this theory that anyone can participate. And so when you get to autocratic businesses and authoritarian business models, that is naturally going to drive your politics in an authoritarian direction. And now look at Google and Facebook. These are companies where the founders have absolute control. They are authoritarian top to bottom. And they value the thing that drives them is the value system of engineering. And the value system of engineering is a beautiful thing, right? It sits there and says, top of the pyramid is efficiency. You know, if you're going to make a motor or you're going to make a system, you want it to be efficient. That makes a lot of sense. But once your systems grow up to the scale that Google and Facebook are at, where they influence whole countries, efficiency is actually not the goal of a democratic society. Sit there and think about it. Self-determination is inherently inefficient. You chose the clothes you're going to wear today. I chose the clothes I'm going to wear today. In Google's model, that's insane. Everybody should wear the same thing, right? And if think about how democracy works, democracy is inherently inefficient. And yet, when you look at the projects that these guys are undertaking outside of their websites, so Google has a smart cities project. Facebook has a cryptocurrency,
in
right?
Toronto, they're doing a lot of work in Toronto, correct?
Well, they've now been forced to stop because of public pushback. But think about it this way: that smart cities project was going in there and literally using surveillance to identify everything that was going on, and then using algorithms to make everything more efficient. Well, the problem with that is that you're up against self-determination and democracy, because the efficiency that you're imposing is by swapping in algorithms for those two things. And I'm sitting there going, whoa, that's terrible. And why is that there? Because in Silicon Valley, the notion is nobody's responsible for harm, that you're allowed. I mean, Silicon Valley views itself as entitled to experiment. And when the experiment fails, you just do another experiment. And if a bunch of people die, you know, they just throw up their hands and move on. And they don't have any sense that they should anticipate harm and prevent it. Now, let's apply this to other forms of AI. AI in resume reviewing. Amazon had an AI for reviewing resumes that rejected every application from a woman because the sample set had been all guys. So the AI was thinking, well, women can't possibly do this job. Take a look at digital redlining in banks, right? Massive discrimination based on race and gender, because the old data sets from which they're based are biased. Think about policing, right? This whole thing about using AI to anticipate problems, that's all based on total nonsense. And it results in massive civil rights violations. And so what we need to do is to recognize that there's a lot of really important things you could do with AI. There's a lot of really important things you can do online. But we need to make this stuff safe. We need to have accountability. We need to treat it like the building trades. If you're an architect or a builder and your building falls down and kills somebody, you are personally responsible. Why shouldn't that be true in tech? Of course it should be true, right? And you need to change the incentives. We need to think about safety. We need to think about privacy. We need to think about competition. Those are the three big areas. And my work has been about essentially helping members of Congress and other officials get educated and to do what needs to be done to make tech safe. Because once we make it safe, then we can enjoy all the benefits of what it gives us.
Sure. I'm glad to hear you say that, because for a minute there I was getting even more scared than I was reading your book. But it sounds like there's a glimmer of hope.
Oh, no, hang on. Anthony, we should be clear on this thing. It's not a glimmer of hope. This is completely within our power. What we're talking about here is that the culture of the United States has, Reagan ushered in this notion that government is the problem. I mean, that's nonsense. Government is us. In a democracy, a government is the people. And we get the government we want. The point here is because of George Floyd, because of COVID, the country is going through a self appraisal right now in which literally anything is possible. And, we're going to have a new president, new vice president, who are committed to rethinking a lot of these issues. And I think Biden really understands that concentrated economic power is actually bad for democracy. It's bad for the economy. So I think he's going to do something about that. And I think we're going to look at tech and go, if we were to regulate these guys intelligently, we would trigger a massive wave of innovation because monopoly is really bad for innovation. And depending on Google and Facebook for innovation has not served us well at all.
So are we less zucked now than we were when you wrote your book? It sounds like there's progress.
So here's the way I would put it, Anthony. There's two big waves going on. The damage being done by these guys has grown geometrically since I wrote the book. So think about it this way. Facebook did an internal study after 2016 to see what impact they had on polarization. The evidence of their own work said 64% of the time when somebody joins an extremist Facebook group, so maybe one that's white supremacy driven or anti-vax or something like that, 64% of the time they joined it because Facebook made a recommendation that they followed. Now let's think about QAnon, a phenomenon that we first identified a couple of years ago, but which Facebook didn't even figure out till this year. Facebook has admitted that the largest QAnon pages and groups had 3 million members. That's just the largest one. So the number is actually bigger than that, which means at least, again, if 64 of those people, 64% went there because of Facebook recommendation, that means Facebook itself radicalized 2 million people or more into QAnon. Facebook absolutely enabled the Kenosha Guard, which led to Kyle Rittenhouse, right? That whole organization of violence took place on Facebook. And that sort of thing happens every single day. And the difference is that it's, basically we've hopped from the digital world, the online world, into the real world. That makes us much worse off than we were, right? We're genuinely worried about militias, all of which were organized on social media, coming into the real world and doing violent things. That's the bad side. Then there's the good side. The good side is the House Antitrust Subcommittee, headed by David Cicilline of Rhode Island, put out a report in which they said, we have hard documented evidence that Amazon, Facebook, and Google are monopolies. It is a brilliant report. Everyone should read it, and it will restore your faith in government. The House Consumer Protection Subcommittee, headed by Jan Schakowsky of Illinois, is doing incredible work both on privacy and on safety. On the Senate side, you have Warren, Warner, Ed Markey, and a number of others who are very active on this. We have 50 state AGs and territorial AGs with antitrust cases against Facebook, a case against Google, right? The U.S. Department of Justice has a case against Google, is about to launch one against Facebook. I mean, things are changing, okay? And the point is we can't.
That's encouraging.
The encouraging thing is everybody's on top of it. The discouraging thing is the companies haven't learned a damn thing.
Well, I was going to ask, so Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, as you write, controls 60% of the voting shares. And he's the guy that is going to have to change if Facebook's going to have to change, right? Do you detect any remorse, willingness to change, willingness to, or perception of the problem existing there?
Yeah. So I think that there's more than one thing going on in the questions you're asking. So I have not been able to spend time with Mark for a decade. Okay. When I knew him well, he, as I describe in the book, he has some superpowers that are really, really impressive. And his vision of connecting the whole world on one network controlled by him motivates everything he does. And people get confused. They think it's about money. Money is merely a scorecard. It's really about power. And the thing is, in Mark's vision, connect everybody on that network, on Facebook, is the most important thing anybody can do. Mark's vision of gaining value through efficiency, right? Again, that's a value system. My point to you is I don't want to judge whether those are good or bad things that he believes. What I want us to recognize is that he does not have the right to impose that vision on any country without a really serious debate first. And that debate has not happened. Fundamental to surveillance capitalism is the B.F. Skinner notion of this is a giant experiment that you conduct outside the awareness of the victim. And so they're not honest about what they're doing. And all I'm trying to do is to say, excuse me, people, this is going on whether you like it or not, whether you perceived you're harmed or not. You are being harmed. You would not have had Trump. You would not have had the COVID death rate we have now.
How about the Rohingya?
There are a million things you wouldn't have if these guys weren't behaving as badly as they are. And the reality is the things we like about these platforms, we can have without the bad. We just need to insist. We need to recognize that the notion that the rules of Facebook and Google govern our lives more than the laws of the United States of America, that simple fact should create pressure for much more responsible action and much more transparency by these platforms. And I think policymakers are coming around on that. But we really need every voter to take this seriously. I mean, the big threat to the vaccination program for COVID is disinformation. And the problem is that even if you got Facebook and Google to disappear tomorrow, the effect they've already had creating these networks of non-believers is going to persist. So we really need to think about this in a very big way, because no matter what Biden's goals are, disinformation is going to stop him cold if we can't do something about these things.
You know, there's a really chilling, one of the most chilling things in your book is when you described your meeting with Mark and you give him some advice and he sits there and looks at you for something like 5 minutes without saying a thing.
Well, hang on, that shouldn't be chilling. So I'm not going to spoil the story. There is an anecdote at the beginning for what was the strangest meeting I've ever had. But the thing to understand is that Mark was showing enormous respect because he was taking real time to think about something I was saying that was, I would say, totally unexpected. He was not anticipating it. And rather than just sort of blow it off and shoot from the hip, he took a long time to think about it before he responded. It made me incredibly uncomfortable. But I also thought I was in the presence of like an Olympic class event, okay? And, you know, it is a funny story, but you shouldn't disrespect him from it, okay? Mark Zuckerberg is, again, I disagree with his value system. And that's the debate I want to have. This is not a personal issue. This is, I have a vision, which I would argue is grounded in American history. But it is certainly something that you're entitled to disagree with. And you're entitled to disagree with Mark's interpretation. The problem that we've had is we've not been able to have an honest conversation because neither the folks at Facebook nor the folks at Google or Amazon are honest about what they do. They spin literally everything. And as a consequence, the conversations never really happen. And, you know, I think we're much closer to it happening now, but, you know, it hadn't happened yet.
It's from your book, what I take away is that the management of Facebook is in its own filter bubble.
Yes.
They're living in their own filter bubble and they can't see beyond it. Just like
but let's be fair. Let's be fair. From 2000 and I don't know, roughly 2000, certainly from 2012 when they went public, right after they went public, to 2017, everything written about that company was positive. Stock price kept going up. They got nothing but positive feedback for everything they were doing. And, the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya happened in that window. The destruction of the US presidential election, Brexit, all those things happened in that window. And they're going, hey, no problem, right? And I mean, a man was murdered on Facebook Live like the second day that product was out there, right? A joy killer. And one of the top Facebook executives wrote this memo going, our mission is so important and the scale is so large that bad things are going to happen. People are going to die. Someday there's going to be a terrorist event. And we just need to recognize that these things are going to happen. And we cannot be distracted from our mission. And the thing is, when the terrorist action happened in Christchurch, their reaction was exactly as you predicted. They go, too bad. Next. And I'm going, guys, I recognize that's what you believe. But we as a society are entitled to disagree with that. And if enough of us get together, we can make our viewpoint not only known, but turn it into policy. And that's been my goal.
So we have a question from the audience on this topic, and somebody asks, what can average citizens do to counter these trends? And I would add to that, should we all delete our Facebook accounts? Should we leave the field? What's the right approach?
So the most important thing to understand is that we have way, way, way past the moment where individual action is going to affect the outcome. So, if you want to get rid of your Facebook account, God bless, but that isn't going to make any difference. What's going on here is so much bigger than the Facebook app or the Instagram app or, Google or Google Maps or Gmail. These guys are all migrating from ad-based products into the real world with smart cities, with cryptocurrencies, with all kinds of other apps and products that they have. So the model's just incredibly dangerous. We are in the realm where politics is the only solution. So we need to speak to policymakers and insist that action be taken. And it's really important in the Northwest where, you have, shall we say, as we do in California, some of our elected representatives are, shall we say, more sympathetic to the industry than they are to their constituents. Now, what's interesting in California is that the Bay Area House delegation are uniformly aligned with the reformers, which is amazing because they're the ones who have all the employees and the companies in their districts. The senators have been not helpful at all. Now, I would argue that state of Washington, where you've got both Microsoft and Amazon, who are both wrapped up in this to their eyeballs, the senators have been very supportive of tech. And that's mostly been true in Oregon, although there's been, Merkley in particular, but even Wyden are starting to recognize how different the world is. And I'm very hopeful that their voices will really matter because Wyden, as the co-author of Section 230, which is it's the thing that basically is the get out of jail free card for internet platforms. If he becomes completely committed to to reform, that's going to make a huge difference.
I have to ask you on that subject. Donald Trump this week came out and said he would not vote for a defense appropriation unless they stripped or overturned Section 230, which grants the tech platforms all of this, latitude. What's happening there?
So I strongly recommend that you not get your technology insights from Donald Trump.
Of course, they're right.
So Section 230 was a law passed in 1996 that actually was designed to encourage internet platforms to moderate extreme voices, harmful voices, so that people wouldn't get hurt. So this was designed to tamp down on hate speech. It was designed to tamp down on calls for violence. The courts have interpreted it as blanket immunity so that instead of internet platforms trying to eliminate harmful content, they've let everything go. They've just said hands off completely. And so the problem with 230 is it's been interpreted in a perverse way. Now, Trump wants to get rid of 230 because if you got rid of it, then the companies would be treated the way publishers are treated and liable for everything that goes on there. The problem with that metaphor is that broadcasters have one product for everybody. Internet platforms have a separate Truman Show for every single, for literally billions of users. And that complicates, it's the, your standards and mine may be different, right? What might be hate speech to you may not be for me. It's a much harder problem to solve. And so there is actually an argument that you need some sort of rule to encourage people to do moderation that protects them, right? Because otherwise the concepts that we have today disappear entirely. So you probably would not see much user-generated content. Twitter would probably have to go away. Big parts of Facebook would have to go away. And, it would all depend on how the courts treated things afterwards, but that would be the things people were worried about. The point here is Trump's trying to do it because he's trying to gain political advantage on behalf of people who think like him, to the detriment of everyone else.
Okay, so we have another question. I wanted to bring this up too. I've always wondered why somebody didn't start an alternative network that could be a Facebook without all of the surveillance and all the bad things. But what we've seen now is Parler, which is an alternative to Twitter, which seems to be like Twitter, but 10 times worse.
So
what's the outlook for other social networks like that?
These guys are monopolists, and it's really, really, really hard to launch something in this environment, have any chance of success. And the problem is that with Facebook in particular, is that Facebook is 100 different apps all integrated together. So if you wanted to compete with Facebook, you should pick one thing like Facebook groups and get that right. So if you sit there and think about what is Parler, Parler is Twitter for right-wing people. What is TikTok? It's just short videos, right? What was Instagram? It was just iPhone photographs, right? The way you get these things started is with a very narrow focus. So if you wanted to compete with Facebook, you'd want to take on one piece of Facebook and compete with that successfully. And that's what's missing. Nobody's been doing that, and at least not successful. Parler, I think, is going to go away fairly quickly. But I mean, let's put it this way. They either need to change their strategy really dramatically and attract a very different kind of audience, or it's going to cease to be influential.
Yeah.
Because for the audience that they have, that audience, a big part of the fun, right?
It's trolling.
It's trolling. And how do you troll people who agree with you?
Yeah, it's hard. So I think we're just about out of time, but I just want to say once again that if you haven't picked it up, I'm going to plug your book since you haven't. You got to pick up Zucked, Waking Up to the Facebook Catastrophe. I think it's a
Can I plug a couple other books? I would really recommend Shoshana Zuboff's The Age of Surveillance Capitalism.
That's a great one.
It is really deep. It's very long, but it is the greatest book on economic thinking probably since Karl Marx, right? I mean, it's really something else. Another book is No Filter by Sarah Fryer. It's the history of Instagram, and it really helps you appreciate the how twisted the culture of Silicon Valley is. There's one called Brotopia. By Emily Chang from Bloomberg, that describes the male culture of Silicon Valley quite brilliantly. And I think these things it's useful to look at all this because there's nothing inevitable about this stuff. It only exists because we allow it to. And, we can change that if we want. And we've done it in the past. We've cleaned up bad behaving industries, cleaned up chemicals, we cleaned up pharmaceuticals, we cleaned up the building trades, we can clean up tech.
Roger, I feel better now.
Yeah, you should. You should. No, I mean, we're going to move forward, okay? But the thing is, everybody's got to say that it matters. If everybody sits there and says, I want everything to be exactly the way it is today forever. Well, you understand if that's true, you're not making your own choices, right? A lot of these things you're worried about because these guys have been poking you.
Yeah. I have about a million more questions, and I think our audience does too here. But I got to be mindful of time. Do we have? How we doing, people? Oh, okay, good. All right. One more. So we covered that. Um, what do you get the sense that this administration and this government is going to do anything to bring back a more traditional idea of antitrust, which, as
So
you said, is
yeah,
completely. I mean, are we going to actually see antitrust cases full blown from a Biden Justice Department?
I think you would have seen full blown antitrust cases from a Trump uh, Justice Department. I mean, they had started it. I mean, I think antitrust is going to move to in the direction of the more traditional model, which right now we say the only sign of harm, the only thing that says consumer harm is an increase in consumer prices.
Yeah.
Right. Well, that completely overlooks any competitive behavior towards suppliers, towards employees, towards customers, anything else. And so, I think we are already making that move, and there will be cases.
Mute, mute, mute.
So there will be cases. The important thing is it's antitrust is not enough by itself. We also need to do safety, which is we need to create liability for these companies that they can't get out of in their terms of service. And we need to rethink privacy. We need to recognize that your personal data is an extension of your body, and it should be treated as a human right, like a bodily organ, not something that's commercial that you buy and sell. Because even if you're not uncomfortable with what's done with that data to you, the problem now is that data is used against everybody else, and other people's data is used. Okay. And
All
so
right.
we need to change that.
One final last short question. What's it like being Roger McNamee in Silicon Valley now? How is all this received by your colleagues and friends?
I'm in quarantine, so I have no idea. I mean, look, I have a very different set of friends than I had 4 years ago when this journey started.
Interesting.
And that's okay, right? I mean, none of this is personal. This is a battle of ideas, okay? And you know, I have an old-fashioned view of America. I like democracy. I like self-determination. These guys don't, and I I'd like to have a conversation about that. I don't think they should be allowed to win without a fight.
Well, that's what we need is more conversation. And thank you so much for your time, Roger. This has been a delight.
My pleasure.
I've learned a lot.